and welcome to Women's Equality Day 2020 at Kansas City, Kansas Community College. I'm Jennifer Gieshen. I'm Coordinator of Women and Gender Advocacy in the Counseling and Advocacy Office. And today we're celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage. Women got the right to vote in 1920 after 70 years of working. So today we are out in the garden because of the pandemic. We are filming in the Cooper Foreman Heirloom Garden that was donated to the campus from the Wyandotte County Historical Museum with the help of Pam Lewis Walden. And there's a team of volunteers that takes care of this garden. Today we have a very special speaker, Dr. Sarah Bell. She earned her PhD in history, specializing in women's history, and she is the development officer at Watkins Museum in Lawrence, Kansas. And without further ado, Sarah Bell.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to this presentation. I'll be talking today about women's suffrage in Kansas. As Jennifer mentioned, this is the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And even though in 1920 we're celebrating and commemorating this 100th anniversary, it took many years and many generations of women to finally be successful. And within that story of the national suffrage movement, Kansas was actually often a leader. And so this presentation today will give an overview of the women's suffrage movement in Kansas. We'll highlight some of the women leaders at the national and state levels. And you're going to learn as well about how this mostly white suffrage leaders discriminated against women of other races, classes, and ethnicities. And so I want to explain today that the story of suffrage is a complicated one. It's full of victories and failures, courage and discrimination, perseverance and defeat. But actually, I'm not going to be starting in 1848 with Seneca Falls or even in Kansas, but just a little bit earlier than that. And I want to start by talking about a group of women called the Haudenosaunee, or the women of the 6 Iroquois nations, which are made up by the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora. The Haudenosaunee continued to treat women as equals even after the United States was established, and the government tried to get Native American tribes to change their ways of governing. Many had this matrilineal society prior to the arrival of Europeans. And the leaders of the early women's rights movement, women such as Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Gage, spent time with the Iroquois women. They interacted with and observed them, and this impacted their views on what was actually possible for women at a time when women were taught by the church and society that women were created to be subordinate to men. It was these same women who then wrote the Declaration of Sentiments and pushed for women's rights because of the Haudenosaunee Indians. And this illustration that I found, I think, aptly summarizes the differences between white Anglo-European women and the Iroquois women, who, we need to remember, were contemporaries of each other at the time. And people at this time even understood the differences, as this illustration shows, and which made commentary on the themes of savagery and civilization. And the words in this box really explain how the women of the Iroquois owned the land, the lodge, and the children, that theirs was the right of adoption, of life and death, and that they supervised domestic and foreign policies, and that their lives were valued as high as man's. At the bottom, you see that it says, Iroquois women, we whom you pity as drudges, reached centuries ago the goal that you are now nearing. So 1848 is an important year in the women's rights story. But we must not forget the significant role that Iroquois women and how they influenced the women suffragists as contemporaries and not just as historical examples. But let's move now to Kansas. So the timeline of women's suffrage in Kansas spans more than 50 years. And from the beginning of the movement to when women's suffrage was first being talked about and pushed for, to the end when Kansas women received the right to vote in 1912. You can see that Kansas women actually got the right to vote 8 years prior to the 19th Amendment. So I'll talk first about Clarina Nichols. She was an abolitionist from Vermont who moved to Kansas in 1854 with the opening of the territory of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nichols was one of the many East Coast abolitionists who made the move because they wanted to ensure Kansas was brought into the Union as a free state. At the same time, though, Nichols was actively advocating for women's rights. In fact, part of the reason she made the move from Vermont to Kansas was because she believed the newness of this Kansas territory meant more flexibility for women's rights. She said, "I could accomplish more for women and with less effort in the new state of Kansas than I could in conservative, old Vermont, whose prejudices were so much stronger than its convictions. I want to work for a government of equality, liberty, fraternity." Clorinda Nichols gave speeches across Kansas in support of women's suffrage, and she drew the attention of a group that was founded in 1858 called the Moneeka Women's Rights Association. The Moneeka Women's Rights Association was this amazingly radical group made up of men and women, and they were fully supportive of women's equality, and they had a long list of reasons why. In addition to women's basic rights as humans created by God, the Moneeka group argued that women needed the same access to education. And because she is, quote, "made subject to laws which she has no voice in making, and which deprive her of the ownership of property and of herself, and give even her daily earnings to the control of others." The Wyandotte Constitutional Convention was held in 1859. Clorinda Nichols was able to attend, but she could not officially attend as a delegate or even officially address the delegates because she was a woman. But she sat in the crowd and she listened to the discussions of the men, and she sat there supposedly with her knitting, listening, and after hours, she pushed for full suffrage for women to be added to the state constitution. Now, Clorinda was not successful in this push for full suffrage, but she did get some significant items in the Constitution for women. The most liberal property and guardianship rights in the country at that time for women, and the right to vote in school board elections. Kansas was the first state in the country to give all white women the right to vote in schools. Now, this push in 1859, and with the Kansas becoming a state in 1861, led to the first campaign in the country. It was happened in Kansas to push for full suffrage for women. And this was in 1867. That year, Kansas legislators voted favorably on 2 referenda for suffrage, one for women and one for African American men. The amendment was then sent to the people of Kansas for a vote. Now, national leaders for suffrage were already paying attention to Kansas because of Clorinda Nichols and what she had done just a few years before. And so they made the long journey from their East Coast homes over to Kansas to help campaign for the vote. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were 2 of those women. Now, unfortunately, despite all of their efforts, both of the referenda for suffrage failed. And this is something to keep in mind, is that in addition to this year being the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, it is also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. In Kansas, this discussion was happening 3 years prior to the passage of that amendment in 1870. And so women felt betrayed and abandoned by the very men, Republicans and African Americans, who had worked beside for decades to help advance social change, namely abolition. And a couple years later, at an American Equal Rights Association meeting, Frederick Douglass, a social reformer and abolitionist, and Susan B. Anthony had an argument about which group had a more urgent claim to the vote. Frederick Douglass said that for Black men, voting was a matter of life and death, while Susan B. Anthony said precedence should be given to women as the more intelligent and moral group. This caused Anthony and Stanton to split away and form the first women's organization called the National Woman Suffrage Association. But not everyone agreed with their methods or their vision, and another group formed called the American Woman Suffrage Association. And those 2 groups did not join together again until 1890. Now, after the defeat in 1867 for Kansas suffrage, for women to get full suffrage in Kansas, not a lot happened for about 20 years. A whole generation went by before suffrage really started to pick up again. And it might not sound like a lot to us today, but in 1887, 20 years later, Kansas became the first state in the country to give women the right to vote in city or municipal elections. And with that vote, Kansas became the most progressive state in the country with support for women's suffrage. So let me explain how they got there. As I said, after the defeat in 1867, it really decimated the movement for suffrage in the state. Some things were happening at the local level, but not a lot statewide. And it wasn't really again until the 1880s that movement started to pick up again for suffrage. Now, at the national level, there was a split that had occurred in the national group to form these two separate organizations. So something else filled that gap nationally in the meantime, and that was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was organized in 1874, also known as the WCTU. The WCTU grew out of a desire that women had to protect the home from the evils of alcohol that their husbands and fathers were bringing home. And Frances Willard was the woman who became the leader associated with the WCTU and really pushed for this idea that women had the right to go out in public in order to advocate for this home protection. And why this is so important is that at the time, there was this common belief known as separate spheres ideology. And that was essentially that men were in the domain of the public, doing business and law and politics, even speaking in public, while women were in the domain of the home. And women, to have this step out into the public, showed that this was something that was really significant and important to them. And they justified this big step because of what they needed to do to protect the home. In Kansas, prohibition was an especially important topic, and it was something that in 1881, we added an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit alcohol. Now, this prohibition was something that was very much an issue for Republicans, not so much Democrats. But there was this brief takeover in Kansas history in the 1880s where a Democrat took over as governor. And he wasn't so sure about this prohibition amendment that had been passed just a year before. And he questioned whether Kansas really needed this in their constitution. So women saw their chance. They told the Republicans that if they had the right to vote in city elections, that they would vote the right men into office to help enforce the Prohibition Amendment. And so, unlike in 1867, there was not a popular vote or an effort to add a constitutional amendment. Legislators, who were mostly Republican at the time, voted to give women the right to vote in city elections. But sometimes those right men weren't always men. And what we have is that the first woman mayor in the country was actually in Argonia, Kansas, Susanna Salter, who was elected in 1887. She was actually elected as a joke. There were men in the town who were not happy with this prohibition in the WCTU group, and they thought that if they put a woman on the ticket as mayor, that no one would vote for a woman. But in fact, they ended up being very wrong, and she won by 2/3 of the vote. And so Susanna Salter, who graciously accepted, even though she did not realize she had been put up for election, was mayor of the town of Argonia for a year. You can believe that there was press coverage across the state and the country about this, and that she had letters and visitors come and give their congratulations. But a little closer to home, to the northeast Kansas, is another woman, Lucy Sullivan. She became the first woman mayor of Baldwin City in 1889. And she, unlike Susanna Salter, actually ran for her office, and she won. She and her all-woman city council passed a series of ordinances, which included no drinking, no smoking tobacco, to clean up and beautify the city, and to build what is now known and still standing today as the Women's Bridge. So during the 1887 campaign, Kansas women understood the local politics and they saw their opportunity. They knew Republicans valued prohibition, and they knew they could use their association with the WCTU and this idea of home protection and this moral crusade, and they could use that as leverage in the political sphere. In Kansas, this relationship worked really well between the WCTU and suffrage. It didn't always work so well in other states, but the two groups did continue to have a lot of overlap because many women in the WCTU understood if they were really going to make a difference in abolishing alcohol, they needed to vote it out. Now, I mentioned that Kansas was seen as the most progressive state in the country in 1887 because of what it did with municipal suffrage. And we know this because yellow became the official color of the national suffrage movement. And why was that? For the Kansas sunflower. Now, a few years later, women believed they had the momentum to continue their huge win in 1887. So in 1894, we have the second attempt at full suffrage for women. And Colorado had passed its full suffrage for women just the year before in 1893. Kansans believed they were going to follow suit. And two women leaders in Kansas, Laura Johns and Annie Diggs, were the president and vice president of the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association during the 1890s. However, they did not share the same political views. Laura Johns was a Republican, while Annie Diggs was a populist. Populism had briefly taken over in Kansas during the early 1890s. It was a movement of farmers, laborers, and other rural workers, and they had a long list of demands, but they were primarily focused on issues that impacted agriculture. One of the issues they supported was women's suffrage. Republicans had been supportive of women's suffrage for many years, but as you heard, sometimes it worked out well, like in 1887, but sometimes not so much, as it did in 1867. And some women thought that populism was actually going to be the better outlet to get support for the vote. Unfortunately, though, even though the women tried to stay nonpartisan within their suffrage organization, despite their differing political views and alliances with the political parties, they got caught up in the broader partisan politics and competition between Republicans and populists. Neither political party ended up lending their full support to women and that they thought they would get. And so again, women in Kansas were defeated with this attempt to get full suffrage in 1894. Now, I mentioned already this concept of separate spheres. And it's really important to really underscore that, especially for the white middle class at this time, that women really were expected and believed to be really their domain was in the home. They should not be involved in these professional activities, and they should not be speaking in public or engaging in politics. Women's suffrage, especially during the late 19th century, was considered a very radical topic. Because while the WCTU was okay, women were arguing because of protecting the home, they had to go out into the public. Suffrage was doing something completely different. They were saying that not only did they deserve, they were not just using the home as their base for going out into public. They believed that they should fully be able to be full equal citizens with all the political rights just as men. There was a fear that this was going to lead to a complete reversal of gender roles and the separate spheres ideology that had been dictating society for so long. And there were a lot of political cartoons that emerged during this time to highlight this very thing, where what would happen if a woman was too busy to go off voting out in the public? What would the men, the husbands, the fathers would have to stay at home looking distraught, caring for their children and taking care of the home. Now, in all of the different movements that I've talked about so far, Women's Christian Temperance Union, suffrage, and others such as women's clubs, it is something important to remember that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was very much driven and led by white women. And I mentioned in 1869, the argument between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass about who deserved the right to vote first. And this language early on really set the tone for the remainder of the campaign for suffrage for women, where the idea that white women were going to use their race to justify why they deserved the right to vote first. And so you see that throughout these different organizations, white women often barred Black women and other women of color from joining their organizations, which often led to the creation of African American women to create their own organizations. And you can see here that, again, similar to this idea of a political cartoon talking about gender roles at this time, this is a political cartoon from the early 1900s by a Kansas artist who's showing that this racial divide is not just something that scholars are looking back on today and identifying it, but that people could see and understand it was happening during that time as well. And through all this, it is important to understand which women were really allowed to go out and advocate and campaign for the right to vote. In the suffrage movement, women really began elevating their race over gender, as I said, in 1869, with what Anthony said to Frederick Douglass. And this emphasis on racial difference in order to define the civilized status continued throughout their campaign and showed up in other ways as well. In order to distinguish themselves from immigrants and minorities, white women argued that being denied suffrage made them the political peers with the most uncivilized and least respected members of society. This painting shows that Frances Willard is in the middle of 4 other faces: a mentally disabled man, a convict, a madman, and a disenfranchised Native American. However, even though African American women were really blocked from joining these mainstream organizations led by white women in suffrage and WCTU, there were many African American women who fought for suffrage within their own clubs and organizations, despite the segregation. And there are 3 examples from the 1890s and early 1900s from Kansas. First is Mary, or Mamie Dillard. She led efforts in the support of women's suffrage and leadership. She was the only African American in her graduating class at Lawrence High School and went on to graduate from the University of Kansas in 1896. And when she was teaching school in Lawrence, poet Langston Hughes was one of her students. Another woman is Naomi Anderson. She was a temperance advocate and suffragist who lectured across the country in numerous states, one of them being in Kansas. Amazingly, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, Naomi Anderson was one of the very few African American women who was actually an organizer with the National Association for Women's Suffrage. And she worked to support African American women and advocated for women's rights and civil rights. Thirdly, another woman was Carrie Hughes, a journalist for the Atchison Blade, the mother of poet Langston Hughes. Her father, Charles Langston, fought for voting rights for African American men during the 1867 campaign, when Republicans tried to split the 2 groups, women and black men, into separate referenda. Carrie carried on her father's legacy of civil rights work by focusing on promoting equal rights for black women. After the defeat in 1894, women again were led to many years of not doing much suffrage work in the state of Kansas. It wasn't until about 1910, 1911 that there was an indicator that maybe there was a time that Kansas women were able to again campaign for full suffrage. Lucy Johnston became the president of the state association in 1912. And by that time, women had really learned their lesson from their many failed attempts. They didn't focus only on fellow white middle-class women. They included more diverse voices in their campaign. They also had technology that helped them reach more people across Kansas, namely automobiles. And they gained significant allies at all levels of government, including the governor at that time, Governor Stebbs, who really was thanks to the fact that his wife was a suffragist. And on November 5th, 1912, Kansas went to the polls. The next morning, Kansas women awoke to the news. The constitutional amendment had passed. 175,000 to 159,000. Kansas suffrage had won, and women had full voting rights. Kansas was the 8th state in the nation to give women the right to vote. And this famous illustration shows this awakening that had been occurring in the West for a couple of decades, starting with Wyoming in 1890, Colorado in 1893, to Kansas in 1912. Suffrage was very much viewed as this Western wave sweeping east across the nation, and that it was really only a matter of time that the wave would reach the other coast. So why the West? Well, there's a couple of reasons and some beliefs for why that could be. One, you can think back to what Clarina Nichols said in the 1850s when she made her way to Kansas. The newness of the territory meant there was more potential for equality for women to be built into the very structure of the law and the Constitution at the time. There also were just not as many women living in these states. So possibly was this a way to attract them to live in those states and help these men settle the states and those cities? Thirdly, the idea is that the West maybe was just more progressive because it was settled by reformers who believed in such things as abolition and prohibition. Now, Kansas received the right to vote in 1912, but of course, there were only 8 states at that time that had given women the right to vote. There were still many more to go. And Kansas women continued to help other states pass suffrage to their constitutions, as well as work toward the passage for the 19th Amendment. And you see this in multiple examples. In June of 1916, 50 Kansas women marched in the suffrage parade in Chicago during the Republican National Convention. Kansas suffragists gave money to different campaigns, and they sponsored 2 Kansas women who campaigned across the South, who then lobbied legislators to push for suffrage. Kate Richards O'Hare was a native Kansan who spoke in front of the St. Louis courthouse on National Women's Suffrage Day on May 2nd of 1914. She not only spoke in favor of women's suffrage, but spoke out against the coming World War. And Laura Gregg was a Kansas woman hired by the National American Women's Suffrage Association to work as an organizer for suffrage, where she did her work both in Kansas and in other states as well. And in the final years leading up to 1920, suffrage leaders were really divided over the best tactics for how to achieve passage for the 19th Amendment. You had Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a leader of the National Association, who continued to do the work through the legislative channels that for generations suffrage leaders before her had tried to do. However, you also had a woman, Alice Paul, who became the leader of the National Woman's Party, who used militant tactics similar to what the British suffragettes used: food strikes, chaining themselves to the fence outside of the White House, and picketing at public events. And we have a connection to, Kansas has a connection to the National Women's Party with 2 women. Nina Allender was a cartoonist for the National Women's Party, and she designed a Jailed for Freedom pin, a small silver prison door with a heart-shaped lock given to the women who participated in those hunger strikes. And the only Kansas woman to receive that pin was Effie Boutwell Maine Russell from Topeka. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and 1 week later, it officially became part of the Constitution. Not all women automatically received the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. African American women, like men, experienced discrimination due to Jim Crow laws, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes that kept them from voting. Native Americans did not become U.S. citizens until 1924 with the U.S. Citizenship Act. Asian Americans were granted citizenship and voting rights in 1952. That is why, as we think back and think about 1920 and reflect on the 100th anniversary, it is important to say that we commemorate this anniversary and not celebrate it, to recognize that not all women did receive the right to vote at that time. In conclusion, the story of women's suffrage is a complicated one. Women had to fight against beliefs that they were subordinate to men, that they were supposed to remain in the home, and that they were not supposed to be political. Women did not always have a united vision, and white women segregated many women because of their races, class, or ethnicity. Women and men devoted their entire lives to this work and had to persist even when it seemed like it was a pointless effort. So it is important to honor and remember their courage, even if their story is a complicated one. Thank you.